When the media make excuses for why they refuse to go back and correct things they got wrong or fact check the people that they've interviewed, probably the most common is the news cycle. They say, well, the news cycle has moved on. No one's talking about that anymore. News organizations routinely treat the news cycle as though it's this definitive, concrete thing that they just can't possibly control and must obey. Problem is that all those misleading claims and lies are what people come to believe across the country and around the world. And then they quickly move on with this news cycle to the next thing. So those false ideas are firmly implanted in their minds. These days, with the so-called news cycle moving so quickly, the falsehoods are coming at you faster than ever. And that excuse comes right behind it. Oh, well, we've moved on. I get affected by this as well. Sometimes I'm preparing fact checks for you, and then something else happens, and news agencies blow it on that, and I jump over to that new thing in time for the episode. But I stay committed to coming back to what I wanted to tell you, because I know these things have to be corrected. Today, part of what I'm doing here is breaking the cycle. There has been all this reporting about immigration and illegal immigration. And some of the other biggest problems that America is facing are often brought up in the context of illegal immigration, things like drug addiction and human trafficking. As I've checked on reporting, I have found so many basics in these reports wrong. I was surprised by some of what I found, realities that are often the opposite of what the news is making people think. That is coming up today. And reporting failures about immigration tie in directly to a crazy statement made at the Oscars by the director of a lying propaganda film that won Best Documentary. Ahead, you'll hear how this also leads me to tell you about a public radio show, a show that started with coverage of U.S. immigration and went straight from that into ignoring the realities of immigration in a conversation about the Middle East. Plus, the BBC blew it so badly that it pulled a documentary off of its platforms. Can you imagine how bad something has to be for even the disastrous BBC to pull it? All that and more coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. Great to have you here. My name is Josh, and this is They Stand Corrected, the podcast that fact-checks the news. I know we've got new people joining us every week. This week, we have some people joining us who have learned about this show from something called The Contrarian. I want to thank The Contrarian for inviting me to do a column there. For those of you who have not yet heard of it, it's a new newsletter on Substack that says it serves as a, quote, central hub for unvarnished, unbowed, and uncompromising reported opinion and analysis that exists in opposition to the authoritarian threat. So thanks very much for that. I hope you enjoy the show. Subscribe, rate, review, all that stuff. For those of you who don't know, my background is 20 years in broadcasting, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN, where I became lead on-air fact checker. I don't mention this often, but I didn't just become lead on-air fact checker. I pitched into that position precisely because I couldn't stand seeing the news used as open mic nights for liars. So after a lot of trying, I was able to build that position for myself. But I saw how incredibly much of our own reporting would not pass basic fact checking. And that's true for a lot of what's in major media these days. What I wrote about in my first column for The Contrarian was how there were all these fact check reports the morning after Trump's speech to Congress. But that is far too little and far too late. At this point, people have learned that they cannot trust major media to fact check all the time. It shouldn't be an exception when they do it. It should be the rule. People have learned, unfortunately, that news agencies allow lies to be reported and not fact checked. So they have every reason to not count on these news agencies and to not turn to them in the first place. And that is what I'm getting into today. I'm going to start with a couple of things that Trump said in that speech to Congress. He was talking about immigration and specifically illegal immigration. Here's one thing he said.
We need Mexico and Canada to do much more than they've done, and they have to stop the fentanyl and drugs pouring into the USA. They're going to stop it.
That is one of his frequent talking points in discussions of illegal immigration. He brings up fentanyl deaths. He also said this.
Over the past 4 years, 21 million people poured into the United States. Many of them were murderers, human traffickers, gang members, and other criminals from the streets of dangerous cities all throughout the world.
Then there was applause, and then listen to the next words he said here.
And I want to thank Tom Homan.
Tom Homan is his border czar. Before Trump began his second term, Tom Homan was perhaps the leading voice pushing these same kinds of talking points in the media. He has said these kinds of things on Fox, which is to be expected. That's their MO. He has also said it elsewhere. Here he was on CNN in December.
You got a record number of Americans dying from fentanyl coming across that border. You got a 600% increase in sex trafficking. So we got to stop these magnets.
Of course, none of that was fact-checked in the interview or during the show or when that video was posted online. I wanted to play you these clips first because this is what it has been like. Multiple claims presented in the context of illegal immigration coming at you fast and furiously, and then the news cycle moves right on. So you would have no way of knowing how incredibly off these numbers are and what's really going on in America in some super important ways. One claim in there, a figure that Trump used, did show up in media fact checks after his speech. There have not been 21 million people coming over in the past 4 years. No one seems to have any clue where he's even getting that from. Trump does have a long history of just making up figures, or he hears someone somewhere say a thing and then he just goes with it. According to the best statistics available, the country had 11 million of what's called encounters between migrants and law enforcement. But that does not mean that they came into the country. All right. In fact, that figure definitely includes millions of people who were not allowed into the country or were kicked out of the country. Even Republicans have not been claiming numbers anywhere near that high, and that number wouldn't even make sense. But that's just one element here. We've been hearing about fentanyl and sex trafficking in the context of illegal immigration. So I went looking for what we know. Let's start with fentanyl. First of all, the people who smuggle in fentanyl are overwhelmingly U.S. citizens. There's a group that is considered part of the political right. It declares itself libertarian. It's called the Cato Institute. They pulled together a bunch of government data. And if you want to check this out, you can find it in my newsletter. Don't worry about numbers. When I share them here, it's to give you a general sense. If you want the actual hard data, I put it for you online. All right. So they show that 86% of people convicted of trafficking fentanyl were U.S. citizens. More than 90% of fentanyl seizures take place at legal crossing points and at these things called interior vehicle checkpoints. That's where authorities can stop cars to check people's immigration status, right? Not along illegal migration routes. Also, I checked data for recent years. Fentanyl deaths went up under Trump. There's a chart that shows an increase at the end of Obama's term and then a rise at the start of Trump's first term, and then a steep jump in 2019 and 2020 under Trump. Why is no one talking or asking about this? I know from being on the inside, they generally don't even stop to look. It's like, what are the latest talking points? Okay, that's what we'll go with. And there is a bigger story here about supply and demand. If Trump were some brilliant business leader or whatever, you would think he would go to that. The demand for illegal drugs is fueling all of this. Anytime there is demand, there will be supply. Prohibition taught America this. The Cato Institute pointed to data showing that almost everyone, about 99% of people paying for illicit opioids, are U.S. citizens. We need to stop this crisis. If the administration thinks that cutting back illegal immigration will make a huge dent in the trade of illegal fentanyl, then they're not going to get very far. The media should be telling you this, but instead they say, news cycle has moved on. Then there is the horrific reality of human trafficking and sex trafficking, which is a type of human trafficking. No one seems to know where Homan is getting that claim about a 600% increase in sex trafficking. I don't see any source for that anywhere. I'm also not seeing the media fact check it, even though he has said that several times, like what I just played for you from CNN. I'll tell you, I tried messaging him on X. X, formerly known as Twitter, is Elon Musk's playground. Elon is a big figure in this administration, so you would think maybe they would respond there. I have not heard back. Here are some facts about human trafficking. It's incredibly unlikely that you've heard this in any of the recent reports from major media. First, arrests for this went down after Trump took over in his first term. Some credit here to a group called PolitiFact for pointing this out. Quote, official ICE figures for 2017 and 2018, consistent with White House news releases, show human trafficking arrests declining from the last year of Obama's presidency. And again, U.S. citizens are overwhelmingly behind this. I looked at data from the U.S. government. There were more than 1,000 people charged with human trafficking offenses in 2022. That's the latest year available. Of them, 95% were U.S. citizens. Oh, and by the way, 18% were Hispanic, while the majority were classified as white. Now, how about the big picture on illegal immigration? Well, there are a few things you should know. First, there was a spike in illegal immigration in 2020 when Trump was president. Lots of analyses say that that was because of how he handled COVID and COVID restrictions, which had this inverse effect of leading more people to get in illegally. Then there was an increase under Biden. The Libertarian Cato Institute wrote, quote, most of the increase in illegal immigration can be blamed on the strength of the labor market rather than the administration's tinkering with border enforcement policies. Now, none of this makes illegal immigration okay. None of it erases the fact that there are people who come in illegally and do horrible things. All these things are true. It's also true, something I've reported here, that on average, people here illegally are less likely to commit crimes, which of course makes sense because they don't want to have run-ins with police. And there are people here like this.
It was Christmas Eve, and 41-year-old Juan Carlos Salgado was working with a broken hand. It was the result of risking his life to save 2 Houston police officers involved in a devastating wreck on the southeast side.
This is a report from KPRC in Houston about someone who was in the country illegally and was killed in a car crash.
His neighbors say Salgado single-handedly rescued one of the officers from the burning cruiser. But less than 3 weeks later, in a cruel twist of fate, Juan Carlos Salgado, a local hero, is gone.
All the problems I've talked about here, illegal immigration, the drug trade, human trafficking, are complex. Problems can only be solved based on the facts. When anyone, any entity doesn't understand what's really going on, they cannot be expected to make things better. The media should work to make sure that the government and the country know what the truth is. Coming up, why understanding truths about immigration is necessary in order to understand what's so wrong with a public radio show and a propaganda film that was honored at the Oscars.
Hi, this is Sarah from Atlanta. This show is exactly what we need at this moment in time. Josh is a passionate advocate for journalism, calls things as he sees them, and is actively working to reestablish the credibility of the profession. And we all know a strong and independent media is crucial for democracy to exist and flourish. They Stand Corrected truly focuses on facts and objective truth and does an amazing job of revealing the behind-the-curtain influences that can so easily blur them. This podcast is incredibly important, relevant, and I believe is already making a difference in newsrooms around the country.
Messages like this mean so much, especially when they come in the form of reviews for the show. Here's one from Apple Podcasts, which just blew me away. The only podcast I regularly must listen to. It helps me feel reassured that in a world that can feel chaotic and wild, there are people working very hard to advocate for truth and justice. I always leave feeling better informed and also motivated to be a part of the change that we need to help us all connect on the most fundamental levels. An absolute must listen for all. This is so humble brag when I read this stuff, but I have promised people that I will read them. And when you submit yours, I will read yours as well. This fuels me. It helps me keep going through all the hard work of putting together this podcast. Thank you. When I was looking into the reporting around immigration, I wondered whether anyone in the news has talked about problems with that reporting. And I did find something.
There's this feeling of, okay, well, that was Obama's crisis. That was Trump's crisis. This is Biden's crisis, as opposed to understanding it's one story that's unspooling in the region and in the wider world.
That is from a public radio show called On the Media. I've mentioned them before. This episode that I found began with host Brooke Gladstone talking with Jonathan Blitzer of The New Yorker about the complexities of covering immigration.
The politics of this issue, which are so irresistible to cover, are so bruising, that tends to dominate the conversation, sort of what the consequences will be for a particular administration. Does this sabotage other elements of their agenda? And we kind of gloss over what's led to the situation at the border in the first place.
So what drops out of the narrative?
The actual circumstances driving people to leave their homes in the first place and come to the U.S. border.
He then went into a history lesson.
In the early 1980s, the Cold War raging at its peak. And so the United States government was simultaneously.
Then this same episode covered one and only one other topic. It's one you hear about often on this show. I'm telling you, it's the media doing it. They go straight from one topic into their favorite punching bag, Israel. Brooke brought in Ayad el-Baghdadi, whom she identified as a Palestinian human rights activist, as well as writer and author. He said that what he wants for the region is, and this is his word, decolonization.
It's not really about removing people. It's about removing supremacy. There's no longer colonizer and colonized. There's simply equal citizens in one state.
Seriously? And he kept going while she did nothing to question or challenge him.
We have to have the imagination to build that kind of mass movement premised upon equality, premised upon solidarity.
That is the same newly popular, designed for the media line that a man named Yuval Abraham used at the Oscars. I mentioned him last week. He is the Israeli co-director of a propaganda film, Trashing Israel, that won an award for documentary, of course. It presents a very misleading version of what's actually happening in a part of a stretch of land that is known as the West Bank, because Jordan occupied it. I talked about this last week. I corrected part of what he said then, but here is another piece of what he said.
There is a different path, a political solution without ethnic supremacy, with national rights for both of our people.
To people who don't know facts, this stuff sounds beautiful. But radio shows like On the Media and documentaries are supposed to be about the truth. And I say here in just about every episode, truth equals facts plus context. To understand how crazy those claims are about solidarity and all that, you need facts plus context. And you know where that starts? Immigration. On the Media was just talking about the importance of understanding causes of immigration. And then they go straight into this nonsense without helping anyone understand the reality of what's going on in that region. How about doing exactly what the guest just said? Look at the actual circumstances. On the Media didn't, and neither have any of the major news agencies that have published or played that clip from the Oscars. But I will, because this is a story of a people known by different names, the people of Israel, people of Judea, hence Jews, people of Zion, all terms for the same thing, forced to flee their land as refugees because empires took over. And because they don't try to make anyone be like them, they remain a minority when they go places. And since people in power often look for minorities to scapegoat, this group of people ends up getting kicked out of other lands when that happens. This is a story of centuries of being forced to flee various places due to bigotry. Meanwhile, people who are now referred to by the world as Palestinians are Arabs. The Arab Empire was built through conquest, colonization, enslavement, forced conversions, slaughter, occupation, all these things. It is not Islamophobic to say any of this. It's not Arabophobic. It's not anything phobic. Facts are not phobic. This is just history. Here is someone I told you about once, Edwin Black. He wrote a book about this history.
The history shows us that the beginning of the Arab hatred and the Muslim hatred for the Jews began in 627, when the Jews of Medina were exterminated by Muhammad. Medina was largely a Jewish city. In fact, the word Medinat comes from Hebrew. After the Jews of Medina refused to convert, it turned to Mecca, and the Jews were exterminated one by having their heads severed by Muhammad and his colleagues. Then came the Islamic conquest of all of the Arabian Peninsula into the Middle East.
I'm obviously not going to do a whole history lesson here. Let's skip to the 20th century. Empires fell. Nations were born. Tons of them, including Israel. And finally, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, had the chance for self-determination in part of their historic homeland, no longer having to live under the subjugation of other groups. By far, the largest group of people who went into Israel were people who had to escape hellish pogroms in Arab and Muslim nations. Here are a couple of folks who had these experiences. This first one is Ruth Pearl, whose family had to flee Iraq in what was called the Farhud.
Tanks started to spray bullets. 3 bullets went through the window. One probably inches from my mother, who was holding my baby sister in her arm. The family scrambled, and my father said, "We'll go downstairs one by one." And I was getting understanding of strategy here, but they don't want us to be killed more than one at a time.
And here's Steve Aker.
Noise outside, people shouting, "Idbah al-Yahud, Idbah al-Yahud," which means cut the throat of the Jews. I climbed the tree as high as I can, and I saw a lot of people there with swords in their hands, some rifles and shooting, and I just couldn't understand why they shouting, "Idbah al-Yahud." What the hell did I do at 9 years old? They were killing me. They started putting fire to the houses. So that whole evening and night, fires are all over, and still screams were people being murdered and raped.
They were talking to the Shoah Foundation. I'll put videos of these conversations in the newsletter so you can see them. In the 20th century, hundreds of millions of people were displaced. And yes, there were Arab people living under the British Empire at that point in an area called Palestine who were displaced. There were far more Jewish people in Arab and Muslim nations who were displaced, but none of them are demanding that they be given everything back that they had to leave behind. They lost all their land, all their property, everything. This is what happened. So the founding of Israel factually marked the end of colonization. That's not an opinion. It's just literally what happened. Nations were born. And as I discussed in my October 7th speech, you can hear that episode, in founding Israel, people made an incredibly brave choice that is so underappreciated. Democracy was not a thing back then. People weren't choosing democracy. There were zero in that region. But the people who founded Israel chose a democratic system because they knew what it's like to be a minority living under the supremacy of other groups. So that brings us to these statements you heard from on the media and from this crazy guy at the Oscars. This guy who's like so far left from within Israel that like he could believe the earth is flat and fall off of it. Anyway, the idea that the tiny Jewish state is the one standing against acceptance of different people or standing for supremacy, nothing about that makes sense. The Arab Islamic Empire had centuries and centuries to create societies like that and didn't. And if you don't want to go back in history, okay, there are all these Arab and Muslim nations today. Zero of them are democracies with equality. You want to somehow argue that that's irrelevant? Okay. There are 2 Palestinian governments right now. Neither of them works that way. Both are designed for supremacy and have Islamic rule built in. This is not an opinion. You want to live in a country in which minorities have equal rights? Great. Move to Israel if they'll have you. By the way, the Democracy Index places the United States and Israel next to each other basically every year among the world's flawed democracies, which is, of course, the only kind of democracy that really exists. Meanwhile, Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank have authoritarian governments. All of this is context behind the story of that region, which is a story of immigration and becoming refugees and surviving. But when it comes to that, it doesn't even occur to any of these big news outlets to pretend to fact check anything. They just let these folks say stuff as long as it serves the big lie of the left, big bad Israel. Immigration stories are some of the biggest stories of humanity. Learning truths about them, about how humans came to be in the places where we are, about how people treat each other, about the fight between groups that believe everyone should have to be like them, that kind of supremacy, and groups like the people of Israel, people of Judea, Jewish people, who don't believe that you should have to be like them. Studying those stories and understanding how good can beat evil, that is a beautiful part of the history of humanity, but not in today's warped media. Coming up, the BBC blew it so badly that it pulled a so-called documentary. Here's a great free way that you can support this show. Thanks to paid partnerships, there are these simple steps that you can take at just about any given time. If you look in the show notes or the newsletter, you will see that sometimes there are websites you can click on to check something out, or free newsletters you can sign up for from other places, or petitions that you might want to sign. I only share ones that I believe in. When you use my unique links to take those steps, a little bit of money comes to the coffers for this show. It makes a huge difference. So if you could take 1 minute to do that, I would appreciate it. In previous episodes, I've discussed what a disaster the BBC is. It's quite possibly the most influential broadcaster in the world. Its bias was quantified by a 200-page study. I interviewed the head of that study. This is an organization with official contributors calling for death to Israel. Just open bigotry. Imagine how bad something has to be for the BBC to pull it. That has happened. This is a clip from a so-called documentary about life in Gaza. You'll probably not be surprised to learn that this was Hamas propaganda. Now, BBC officials are admitting that they blew it. They say they're investigating because ties directly to Hamas were exposed. What happened is that they got caught. The main contributor is the son of a Hamas figure. And there are reports that they paid a Hamas figure for access and the production and all that, which is illegal because Hamas is listed as a terrorist organization, which is what it is. But don't let that aspect draw your attention away from how this project lied to you. Here is one way. This so-called documentary mistranslated quotes repeatedly from Arabic. When the people in this film said horrible things about Jews, the words in English written on the screen changed that to Israeli forces or Israeli military. The translations also removed the word jihad. Jihad is a call for violence against Westerners, Jews, and anyone who does not toe the line with the demands of Islamist terrorist groups. These days, some people are trying to whitewash the term jihad, but Islamist terrorism is carried out in the name of jihad. This is the kind of thing that people have been getting away with in the media literally for decades, giving English speakers a totally different idea of what's going on in that part of the world. When the BBC pulled this documentary, some activist groups complained. This is a very important sign about journalism today. People who have an insatiable appetite for obsessive anti-Israel reporting. They don't care about civilians killed in wars all over the world. They just want more and more and more anti-Semitic hatred. They are rabid. This one act of pulling an obviously illegitimate piece of lying propaganda, that is unacceptable to them. There's some great coverage of this from The Telegraph and great work here by a group called Camera. I will include it in the newsletter. As always, I want to hear what you think. There are two great ways to contact me. The newsletter is free, but paid subscribers get to message me directly there. That is the first place I check for what to cover. And there is a form that anyone can fill out at joshlebs.com. I would love to hear from you. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week. Before you go, one quick idea. Think of someone you know who might be particularly interested in this episode. Click the share button and send this episode to that person saying, I really think you should listen to this episode. In this era in which people are so overwhelmed with content from the moment they get up to the moment they go to sleep, getting a note from someone they know saying, I think you specifically would find this interesting, that is often the most impactful thing to help people discover this show. Thank you.